It was the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones, the kind that made every breath sting. The city streets were slick from an early drizzle, reflecting the faint orange glow of streetlights. Most people hurried by with their collars up and their hands buried in pockets, trying to get home before the rain started again. On the corner of 8th and Maple, a man named James sat with an old paper cup beside him and a sign made from a torn piece of cardboard that simply read, "Trying to get back on my feet." James had been homeless for nearly 6 months. He'd once worked at a warehouse across town, but when it closed unexpectedly, his savings disappeared faster than he could replace them. He'd tried to hold on, taking odd jobs, sleeping in his car and stretching meals to last days. But when the car broke down, so did the last bit of stability he had. Now he spent his days helping out at a nearby shelter for food, and his nights finding quiet spots where the wind didn't cut too sharply. That evening, he had exactly $8 left. He'd been saving it for a hot meal, something simple, maybe a sandwich and a coffee to take the edge off the cold. He was about to head to the small diner at the end of the block when he noticed a man standing near the bus stop across the street. The man was dressed neatly but not extravagantly, an old grey coat, worn shoes, and a look of confusion on his face as he patted his pockets. James watched for a moment. The man stepped toward the ticket machine, then back, checking his wallet again. His brow furrowed. Something about his expression wasn't prideful or irritated. It was lost, almost vulnerable. "Hey, you all right there?" James called out, crossing the street. The man looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet. Must have left it in the cab." His accent carried a calm refinement, but there was genuine worry in his tone. "I just need to catch the next bus downtown, but it won't take cash unless I load a card. I can't even pay for that." James hesitated, glancing at the diner across the street. His stomach had been growling for hours. He could almost taste the coffee he'd been craving. But something about the man's tone, the quiet frustration, the humility, made him pause. "How much is it?" he asked. $8, the man said with a sheepish smile. "I'll pay you back, I promise." James chuckled softly. "You don't look like the kind who runs off on promises." The man's smile widened. "I try not to." James reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the crumpled bills he'd counted earlier. He unfolded them slowly, hesitating only for a second before handing them over. "Here, that should get you where you need to go." The man's eyes softened. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," James said, forcing a small grin. "Looks like you need it more than I do tonight." The man took the money gently, his voice quiet. "Thank you." "Most people would have just walked past." "Most people do," James said, shrugging. "But sometimes you've got to help, even if it costs you." The man nodded thoughtfully, then extended his hand. "I'm William." "James," he said, shaking it. His palm was rough, the handshake firm but kind. William looked at him for a long moment, as if memorizing his face. "I won't forget this, James." "Don't worry about it," James said, backing away. "Just make sure you get where you're going." William nodded, slipping the bills into the machine and boarding the bus just as it arrived. James watched as it pulled away, his reflection disappearing into the city lights. Then he turned back toward the diner, his stomach now an empty ache. He smiled anyway, a quiet, tired smile that carried both hunger and peace. He didn't have a meal, but he had something else, a sense that he'd done something right. He ended up at the shelter that night, where the volunteers served soup and stale bread. As he sat at a corner table, he thought about William, the way he'd spoken, the warmth in his eyes. It didn't make sense, but there was something about that man that felt out of place, like he didn't belong on a cold street corner fumbling for bus fare. The next morning, James went back to his usual spot by the coffee shop. He greeted the barista as she opened up, swept the sidewalk for a few coins, and spent the morning watching the world move around him. By noon, he had enough for a muffin and a cup of coffee. He didn't expect anything else from the day. But then, around 3 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up across the street. It was sleek and spotless, the kind that didn't belong in his part of town. The door opened, and William stepped out. This time, he wasn't in his grey coat. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, his shoes polished, his posture straight. People on the sidewalk moved aside as he walked, his presence quietly commanding. James blinked, unsure if he was seeing right. William crossed the street and stopped in front of him. "James," he said with a calm smile. "I told you I wouldn't forget." James frowned slightly. "You found your wallet?" William smiled. "Something like that. May I sit?" Yeah," James said, moving his things aside. The man sat beside him on the low stone ledge, his suit pressing neatly against the cold surface. "I didn't lose my wallet," William said quietly. "I was testing something." James looked at him, confused. "Testing?" William nodded. "I run a foundation that funds community renewal projects, housing, education, recovery programs. I've spent years trying to understand generosity. I wanted to know if kindness still existed when there was nothing to gain." James was silent, his mind catching up. "You mean you were pretending?" "Yes," William said simply. "I needed to see who people were when they thought no one was watching." He turned to face James. "You gave me your last $8. You didn't know who I was and you didn't care. You just helped." James gave a small awkward shrug. "I just did what felt right. Doesn't make me special." William smiled. "That's exactly what makes it special." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. "This is for you." James blinked, taking it hesitantly. His hands trembled as he opened it. The number on it made him freeze. $50,000. "I don't," he started, his voice breaking. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," William said softly. "And you should. Consider it an investment, not in charity but in character." James stared at the paper, his throat tight. "Why me?" "Because the world doesn't change through wealth," William said. "It changes through people who act like you did last night." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, cars, voices, footsteps. But for once, James didn't feel invisible. James sat there staring at the check as if it might vanish if he blinked too long. His hands trembled slightly, and he could feel his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. $50,000. The number didn't feel real. For months he'd been counting change to buy coffee, sleeping on concrete and searching trash bins for recyclables. Now a stranger, a man he'd met less than a day ago, was offering him a path out of it. William watched him quietly, not with pity, but with something more complex, understanding. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said softly. "You don't need to decide anything now. I just wanted to keep my word." James swallowed hard. "This doesn't make sense. People don't just do things like this." "They do," William replied gently. "They just forget that they can." James tried to find his voice, but every word felt small next to the enormity of what sat in his hands. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," William said simply. "Except maybe for you to believe that good things still happen." James shook his head slowly. "You could have picked anyone." "I didn't pick anyone," William said. "I met you." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the street fading around them. The wind carried the smell of roasted coffee from the nearby shop, and for a brief second, James thought about all the times he'd watched people walk past him as if he were invisible. Now here he was, sitting next to a man in a tailored suit, holding a check that could change everything. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. William smiled faintly. "The only catch is that you use it for something that matters. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can start again." James nodded, still dazed. "Safe sounds good." William stood, brushing the creases from his trousers. "There's a small business development center 2 blocks from here. Tell them I sent you. They'll help you open an account, manage the funds, and find a place to stay. No strings, no interest, no conditions. You really trust me with this?" "I do," William said simply. "Because you trusted me first." He extended his hand again, and when James shook it, it felt like the most real thing in the world. William gave a small nod and started to walk away, blending back into the crowd. The black sedan was waiting across the street, and before getting in, he turned once more and gave a small wave. Then he was gone. For a long time, James didn't move. He just sat there, the paper trembling in his hands, the world spinning around him like a film running too fast. Then he stood, folded the check carefully, and started walking in the direction William had pointed. The building he found wasn't flashy, just a modest office with a brass plaque that read, "Community Renewal Fund." Inside, the receptionist looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" "I was told to come here by—" "William," he said hesitantly. Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Mr. Halston?" James blinked. "That his last name?" "Yes," she said with a kind smile. "He's one of our primary benefactors. Please have a seat." He sat, still clutching the folded check like something sacred. Within minutes, a middle-aged advisor named Carla came out to meet him. She introduced herself warmly, shook his hand, and led him to her office. "Mr. Halston said you might be coming. You're James, right?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's me," she smiled. "He spoke highly of you." "Of me?" James asked incredulously. "We just met," Carla's smile softened. "He said you reminded him of who he used to be." For the next hour, she walked him through paperwork, helped him open a bank account, and explained how the fund could provide housing support until he got steady work. James listened in stunned silence, barely processing half of what she said. Each signature, each form, felt like a door quietly unlocking after years of being stuck behind it. When he finally stepped outside again, the air felt different. The world hadn't changed, but his place in it had shifted. He stopped at a small diner and ordered a meal. Not just coffee or soup, but a full plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. When the waitress set it down, he stared for a moment before picking up his fork. He didn't rush. He ate slowly, tasting everything, letting the warmth spread through him. For the first time in months, he wasn't counting bites or saving half for later. For the first time in months, he didn't feel invisible. Over the next few weeks, everything began to move forward. The fund helped him find a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a one-room space with clean walls, running water, and a real bed. He picked up part-time work through a maintenance program run by the city. He started saving again, just as he used to, only this time there was purpose in every dollar, but more than the money. What stayed with him was that moment on the corner, the decision to give away his last $8. He thought about it often, not because it had changed his life, but because of what it said about who he was, even when he had nothing. Every Friday, he walked by the same bus stop where he'd met William. Sometimes he stayed a few minutes, just watching the traffic, the people rushing by, wondering if kindness could really echo. And sometimes when he saw someone struggling, a man short on bus fare, a woman counting coins for coffee, he'd quietly step forward, slipping a few dollars into their hand without a word. He never told them his story. He didn't need to. One cold evening, about a month later, as he was closing the door to his apartment, there was a soft knock. When he opened it, he found a small envelope on the floor. Inside was a handwritten note on crisp paper. "James, generosity is a circle. What you gave me that night was worth far more than money. I just passed it on." William James smiled, holding the note carefully before placing it on the table beside his bed. For the first time in years, he felt full, not from food or money, but from knowing that the smallest act of kindness could travel farther than anyone expected. Winter eased into early spring, and for the first time in years, James woke up without shivering. The small apartment he now called home wasn't much. One window, a narrow bed, a table that creaked when he leaned on it, but every corner of it meant safety. He'd learned to appreciate small things again, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of rain on the glass, the weight of a clean blanket at night. It all reminded him of how far he'd come in such a short time. He hadn't heard from William in over a month. The note he'd left still sat on the table, tucked inside the small frame James had found at a thrift store. Sometimes, after a long day of work, he'd look at it and think about how strange it was that one moment of kindness could have rippled this far. He wasn't rich, not even close, but he was standing again. He was living again. One Saturday morning, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years, volunteer at the shelter where he used to eat. He'd gone there when he was cold, hungry, and desperate, always greeted by tired but kind faces who treated him like a person when few others did. It felt right to go back, not as someone in need, but as someone who could finally give something. When he arrived, the head volunteer, an older woman named Gloria, recognized him instantly. "Well, I'll be damned," she said with a grin. "If it isn't James Carter. Look at you, all cleaned up." James laughed softly. "Guess the world finally gave me a break." "Not just the world," she said. "You did too. You stuck around when you could have quit." He helped serve lunch, washed dishes, and spent hours talking to people who were sitting where he used to sit. He didn't tell them about the check or the billionaire. He just listened. Most of them didn't need money as much as they needed to be heard, to be seen, to feel like their story still mattered. Later that afternoon, as he was sweeping near the door, a young man walked in, thin, maybe 25, wearing a torn jacket and holding a small backpack. He looked exhausted. James greeted him with a smile. "First time here?" The man nodded, his voice quiet. "Yeah, just passing through. Lost my wallet and I haven't eaten since yesterday." James felt a pang of recognition deep in his chest. "You're in the right place," he said, setting the broom aside. "Come on, let's get you something hot." He led the man to a seat and brought him a plate of food. The young man started to eat slowly, eyes darting around like he didn't trust the moment yet. James remembered that feeling, the fear of being grateful for something that could disappear. After a while, James noticed him patting his pockets, frowning. "You okay?" he asked. "I was going to catch the bus after this," the man said quietly. "Didn't realize I don't even have enough for the fare." James chuckled softly, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a $10 bill and placed it on the table. "Then it's your lucky day," the man blinked. "You don't have to—" "I know," James interrupted gently. "That's what makes it worth doing." The man hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," James nodded. "Just pay it forward when you can." "That's all I ask." When the young man left, James sat down at the same table and looked around. The smell of soup, the quiet hum of conversation, the sound of laughter from volunteers. It all felt familiar, but this time he wasn't looking up for help. He was looking across eye to eye. That night, as he walked home, the city felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The sunset painted the sky orange and pink, and the sidewalks shimmered faintly from the rain. He stopped by the bus stop where he'd met William months ago and stood for a moment, smiling at the memory. He didn't know where William was now or what he was doing, but somehow he didn't need to. The gift he'd been given wasn't money, it was perspective. It was the reminder that dignity and kindness could survive anything. The next morning, he woke to a knock on his door. When he opened it, there was a delivery envelope addressed to him. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with gold lettering. Halston Foundation Annual Gala, honoring community impact through compassion. Attached was a note written in that same familiar, careful handwriting. "James, it's time people heard your story. Don't worry, it won't embarrass you. It might inspire others to see the world the way you do." He stood there in the doorway for a long moment, the paper trembling in his hand. He didn't own a suit, and the idea of walking into a room full of wealthy people made his stomach tighten. But something told him this wasn't about money or appearances. It was about showing what kindness looked like when it came full circle. That week, he used a small portion of his savings to buy a simple black suit from a thrift store. It fit a little loose around the shoulders, but it would do. When the night of the gala arrived, he took the bus across town, the same bus line where he'd once given away his last $8, and stepped into a hotel ballroom filled with light, music, and people who had never known the kind of hunger he had faced. A hostess led him to a table near the front. His heart beat faster as he spotted William across the room standing near the stage. When their eyes met, William smiled, that same calm, grateful smile from before. He motioned for James to stay seated, then walked to the microphone as the crowd quieted. "Every year," William began, "we honor individuals who remind us that compassion isn't measured in wealth but in humanity. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a man who gave his last $8 to a stranger." The crowd listened intently as he told the story, not in a way that embarrassed James, but in a way that lifted him. He spoke about courage, grace, and how a single act of kindness can ripple through lives unseen. Then, to James's astonishment, William turned toward him. "James Carter, will you please stand?" Applause spread through the room. James rose slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't used to attention, but this wasn't pride, it was gratitude. William smiled. "You reminded me what generosity means. And tonight, I'd like to announce the Carter Fund, a program dedicated to helping individuals in hardship find housing, work and dignity just as you did." James stood there speechless as the applause grew louder. He met William's eyes across the room, both men smiling. Both knowing that their paths had crossed for a reason, neither could have planned. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, chandeliers catching the gleam of polished glass and silver, but to James it all felt unreal. The applause that had filled the room a moment ago still echoed faintly in his ears. People stood and clapped, not because of money or status, but because of something far quieter, a story about kindness. A story that had once belonged only to him. When the noise finally faded, William stepped away from the podium and made his way through the crowd toward James. Cameras flashed, but James barely noticed. Everything felt slower now, the faces, the voices, the surreal stillness that comes when a life you never expected begins to open in front of you. "James," William said when he reached him, extending his hand. "I meant every word." James took his hand firmly. "Oh, you didn't have to do this," he said softly. "I never wanted attention." William smiled. "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." They stood there for a moment, and for the first time James didn't feel smaller than the man in front of him. They were equals now. Two people connected by a moment of decency that had rippled farther than either of them could have predicted. "Come with me," William said, motioning toward the stage. "There's something I want you to see." Together they walked up as the audience settled again. A large screen behind them flickered to life, showing photos of newly renovated housing projects across the city. Bright walls, clean halls, small kitchens stocked with essentials. Then the words "The Carter Fund" appeared in bold letters across the top. "This," William said into the microphone, his voice steady, "is what kindness builds. Because of one act, hundreds more will follow." He turned slightly toward James and said, "Would you like to say something?" James froze for a second, his palms damp, the microphone waiting. He had never spoken to a crowd like this before. But as he looked out at the faces in front of him, men in suits, women in dresses, servers at the edge of the room, he realized they were all just people. The same kind of people who might one day walk past someone like him on the street without looking twice. He cleared his throat quietly. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice low but clear. "I didn't plan to change anyone's life that night. I just saw someone who needed help and I helped him. That's all." The room was silent. "I've been hungry. I've been cold. I've been invisible. And when you've lived like that long enough, you learn that sometimes all it takes to change a person's day is to notice them, to treat them like they matter." I didn't give him $8. I gave him a chance to see that people still care. And somehow that came back to me. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "You don't need a foundation to make a difference. You just need to care when it's easier not to. I learned that when I had nothing. And now that I have something, I'm never going to forget it." The audience rose again in applause, this time louder, fuller, warmer. It wasn't charity they were applauding. It was truth. When the gala ended, guests approached him one by one, shaking his hand, thanking him for reminding them of something they'd lost in their success. He didn't quite know what to say to them all, so he just smiled and said, "Do good when no one's watching." Later that night, as the hotel lobby quieted, William and James sat together in a corner booth near the windows, away from the cameras. A waitress brought them coffee. For a while they didn't speak. They just watched the rain start to fall outside. "You know," William said finally, "when I went out that night pretending to be someone else, I thought I was the one doing the testing. Turns out I was the one being tested." James chuckled softly. "I think we both were, just in different ways." William nodded. "You've given me something I can't repay." "You already did," James said simply. "You reminded me that what I did mattered." They finished their coffee in silence. When they stood to part ways, William clasped James's shoulder. "Keep that check frame somewhere," he said with a grin. "I did," James replied. "It's on the wall right above the table where I read your note." William smiled. "Good. Keep it there as a reminder that the smallest choices often have the biggest reach." When James left the hotel, the rain had softened to a mist. The city glowed under the streetlights, reflections shimmering in puddles like quiet constellations. He walked the few blocks to the bus stop, his bus stop, and waited just as he had on that night months ago. Only now he stood taller, not from pride but from peace. Across the street, a man in a worn jacket searched his pockets at the ticket machine, frustration clouding his face. James watched him for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then he stepped forward, pulling out his wallet. "Hey," he said gently. "Need a hand?" The man looked up, startled, then nodded. "I left my wallet at home. I just need enough for fare." James handed him the cash without hesitation. "Here you go. No need to pay me back." The man blinked, confused. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," James said softly. "I've been where you are." As the bus arrived, the man thanked him and climbed aboard. James stayed on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear into the distance, his reflection faint in the glass of the nearby shop window. He smiled to himself, the same way he had that night in the rain when everything began. Kindness had come full circle, and he'd learned the truth. When you give freely, the world has a way of finding you again.